Hey there! Tonight we are going back to the royal weddings of Victorian England, occasions so enormous that the cake alone weighed 300 pounds, where the bride had to do her own proposing, because nobody alive was allowed to propose to a queen, and where the ladies at the grandest wedding of the century were ordered to dress in grey, lilac and mauve, the official colours of mourning. Almost everything brides do nowadays, the white dress, the veil, the flowers, the cake, the photographs, the honeymoon, can be traced back to one very small 20-year-old on one rainy Monday in February. The Victorians did not inherit the white wedding. They built it, mostly by accident, and tonight it is ours. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. Somehow, it is always 2 a.m. somewhere. Now, dim the lights. Put on a fan if you like that soft wash of white noise. Settle into your pillow, unclench your jaw, and let your shoulders come down from around your ears, because tonight nobody needs you to carry a train, nobody is checking your gloves, and the cake, mercifully, has already been cut. Have you ever wondered why brides wear white? Not the Sunday school answer, which is purity, but the real one, which involves a struggling lace village in Devon and a dress that could never ever be washed. Why it was against the law, actual written law, to get married after 12 noon. Why the most powerful woman on the planet stood up in front of witnesses and promised, out loud and on purpose, to obey her husband. Why a man who broke off an engagement could be sued for it, in open court, with his love letters read aloud to a snickering gallery and printed in the next morning's papers. Why respectable unmarried women went home from a wedding, passed a slice of cake through the bride's ring, and slept with it under their pillows. What a 4-year-old in a tiny Highland outfit did in the middle of the grandest ceremony of the decade, and why nobody stopped him. And the strangest question of all, why did the Queen refuse to sit at her own son's wedding and watch it instead from a hidden room above the altar? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in Buckingham Palace, and it is very early on the morning of Monday, the 10th of February, 1840, and the rain is hitting the windows sideways. You are 20 years old. You are barely 5 feet tall in your stockings. You have been Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland for 2 years and 7 months, and at 1 o'clock this afternoon, in front of the entire watching world, you are getting married. Your name is Victoria. Somewhere below you, several hundred people are already in a state of beautifully organized panic on your behalf. You are the only person in the building expected to stay calm, and you are the only person in the building who cannot. Listen to that rain for a moment, because everybody in London is listening to it. It is coming down in torrents, with a wind behind it that is turning umbrellas inside out along the Mall and out there in it. Since before first light, people have been arriving. They are packing the parks between this palace and St. James's, standing on walls, climbing into the bare February trees and settling on the branches like enormous wet crows, because today, for the first time in longer than anyone can remember, the public has actually been invited to see a royal wedding happen. Not invited indoors, obviously. Invited to line the route, which by the standards of royal weddings so far is practically a seat at the altar. Under the rain, if you lie very still, you can hear the palace waking up around you, layer by layer, like an orchestra tuning, fires being raked and lit grate by grate, floors below, doors, far away, opening and closing at a tempo doors do not usually keep. The kitchens have been going for hours, and somewhere down there the breakfast trays are assembling, and the staterooms are being given a final going over by housemaids moving at a devotional hush. Outside, under the windows, wet gravel crunches in patterns, the carriages being walked into their order, the horses stamping, harness chiming faintly through the weather, soldiers arranging themselves into lines and being inspected by other soldiers, everyone's plumes wilting equally in the downpour, rank conferring no protection whatsoever from February. An entire empire's ceremonial machinery is assembling itself around one small person in a warm bed, and the one small person is granted, by ancient unwritten custom, a few more minutes of pretending she cannot hear it. And you are lying still under the covers doing the thing every bride in history has done on this morning, which is inventory. The ring is ready, the dress is ready, the lace, which took a village most of a year, is ready. The Archbishop has been consulted about the wording, because you had a question about the wording, and we will get to the wording. The cake has been finished for days and is currently the heaviest object in the building that is not furniture. Everything is ready, except possibly you, and there is no rehearsal for the part where the whole world watches you promise your life away at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This is also, though you would not put it this way, the last morning of its kind. You will never again wake up alone. Not tomorrow, not next year, not for the next 21 years, and when at last you do wake alone again, you will spend the rest of your long life grieving it. But that is far away tonight, and this morning belongs to a 20-year-old with cold feet in a large bed, listening to rain, working up the nerve to ring for breakfast. Before you ring, you do one thing. You call for paper, and you write a note, and the note travels along the corridors of your own palace to a young man who slept last night under the same roof, which is itself slightly scandalous and nobody has had the courage to mention it. The note asks in effect how he slept, and tells him the weather is dreadful, and asks him to send one word when he, your most dearly loved bridegroom, is ready. Your most dearly loved bridegroom. You are the head of state of the largest power on earth, and you sound exactly like every other bride who has ever scribbled a note on her wedding morning. And that is the first thing worth knowing about royal weddings. Underneath the cannon and the lace, the bride is just a bride. The second thing worth knowing is how she got here, because the proposal was yours. It had to be. Here is the problem nobody warns you about when you become queen at 18. A queen cannot be proposed to. Nobody in the world outranks you, which sounds wonderful, until you realize it means no man alive is entitled to ask you the question, which means that if you ever want to be married, you, personally, with your own mouth, will have to do the asking, and the man in question is required by etiquette to stand there and wait for it like a parcel. The man in question was Albert. He was your first cousin, which in 1840 raises no eyebrows whatsoever, and we should sit with that for a second, because this is a night about things people found completely normal. Royal Europe is one enormous family tree grafted onto itself, run by a shared grandmother's ambitions and a postal service. Your uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, had been quietly arranging you and Albert at each other since you were both children, the way other families arrange a hand-me-down coat, and when Albert arrived at Windsor in October, 3 months and a bit before this rainy morning, he arrived knowing perfectly well what he was there to find out. What he could not do was ask. So for 5 days you watched him. You watched him ride and dance and be beautiful, which he genuinely was, everyone said so. And on the 5th day you sent for him, and he came into the little audience room, and you, the Queen of England, 20 years old, stood there with your heart going like a mail coach and said, in the careful wording you rehearsed, that it would make you too happy if he would consent to what you wished. Consent. That is a queen proposing. He was not asked whether he loved you. He was asked whether he would consent, and he did. And he took your hands, and afterwards you wrote in your journal that to be loved by such an angel was too great a happiness to describe, and then you underlined it, because the journal was the one place in the empire where you were allowed to be 20. And if you want the unromantic half of the story, it is this, and it is wonderful. Getting married was also the only way for you to move out of your mother's house. You had spent your entire childhood under a system of supervision so complete that you slept in your mother's bedroom every night until the morning you became queen, at which point your first 2 royal commands, more or less, were an hour by yourself and a bed of your own. But even a queen could not simply send her mother away, because an unmarried young woman living alone, even one with her face on the coinage, was unthinkable. A husband was the only door out of that arrangement, and you knew it. And somewhere, under all the genuine love and the angel in the audience room, the most powerful woman in the world got married, at least a little bit, for the same reason as many a girl in a mill town, to get her own kitchen and her own mornings and her mother into a separate building. So that is who is lying in the big bed listening to the rain. A bride with an empire, a bridegroom down the corridor, a mother about to be relocated, and a dress downstairs that is about to change what every wedding on earth looks like. And it is time to go and put it on. The dressing of a queen on her wedding morning is a military operation conducted entirely in whispers, and the general in command of it is a small, brisk, terrifyingly organised woman called Miss Skerritt, your hairdresser, who has been up since 5 and has opinions about everything in the room, including, silently, you. Under her command are the wardrobe maids, and around them orbits Missus Bettons, the dressmaker, who has spent months of her life on what is hanging on the form by the window and is now watching everyone who walks past it, the way a new mother watches strangers near a pram. And here is the thing about what is hanging on the form. It is beautiful, but it is not, by the standards of royal history, spectacular. And that is the whole point of it. And almost nobody in the room understands yet that they are looking at the most influential garment of the century. It is a dress of heavy cream-white satin, woven in Spitalfields, in the East End of London, by English weavers whose trade has been starving for years, and that was deliberate. Every thread of this outfit has been sourced like a government contract, because it partly is one. English silk, English lace, English work, at a moment when English weavers and lace makers are genuinely going hungry, so that when the papers describe the dress tomorrow, and they will describe it down to the last pin, every detail is also a small advertisement that says, "Buy British, the Queen does. There is no crown coming today." That is the decision that will echo. You are entitled to arrive in the full apparatus of monarchy, the crimson velvet robe of state, the diamonds, the works, and you have declined all of it. You are getting married not as a sovereign, but as a woman, in a white dress and a wreath of flowers. And because you are choosing to look less like a queen, every bride who copies you afterwards gets to look more like one. That is the trade that white satin is about to make with the entire Western world, and it starts in this room, this morning, while the rain keeps up its drumming and somebody, somewhere below, is dropping something metal down a staircase. First, though, the lace, because the lace deserves its own chapter in this story, and in a sense tonight is that chapter. Over the satin goes a deep flounce of Honiton lace, and Honiton lace is not fabric so much as arithmetic performed by hand. It is made in Devon, in and around a little fishing village called Beer, by women who sit at pillows stuck with pins, crossing and twisting fine thread around those pins, bobbin over bobbin, hour after hour, at a pace measured in inches per week. Machine lace exists, and machine lace is precisely the problem. It is fast, and it is cheap, and it has been quietly destroying these women's livelihoods for a generation. And so when the palace needed lace, a woman named Miss Jane Bidney was dispatched to Devon to hire the hand workers, a whole village of them, and they have spent the better part of a year making the flounce and the veil that Miss Skerritt is now lifting like an unexploded shell. Think about that year for a moment, because it is a lovely thing to fall asleep on. All those months, in cottages by the sea, lace growing under lamplight a few motions at a time, for a dress the makers would never see worn, for a woman none of them would ever meet. And when it was finished, the patterns were destroyed, broken up, so that this lace could never be made again for anyone, so that no duchess and no banker's wife could ever walk into a room wearing the Queen's wedding lace. Which means the dress being buttoned onto you this morning is not just unique the way all handmade things are unique. It is unique on purpose, permanently, by royal command, and the women of Beer who could have lived for years on reorders sent their finest work out into the world exactly once. And the reason the dress is white, the real reason, is standing right there in the lace. White is the colour that shows handmade lace best. Against white satin, every flower and leaf and scrolling stem of that Devon needlework stands out like frost on a window, and a queen who has commissioned a national masterpiece wants it seen from the back of a chapel. Purity has nothing to do with it. The purity story gets attached later, by magazines, once the fashion needs a moral. This morning, white is simply the correct backdrop for the most expensive lace in England, and it has the useful secondary property that a white dress cannot really be cleaned, cannot be dyed for reuse, cannot honestly be worn again, and is therefore the single most extravagant thing a person can stand up in. A coloured silk says my family has money. A white one says my family has money it does not need back. Now the flowers, and pay attention to the flowers, because for the next 60 years they will follow every bride in the empire around like a signature. Into your dark hair, instead of a diadem, goes a wreath of orange blossom, actual orange blossom, in February in England, which is its own quiet boast, because orange trees do not grow here, and every real blossom in the room has been coaxed out of a hothouse at an expense that would feed a street. In the language of flowers, which this century speaks fluently, Orange blossom means chastity and fruitfulness at the same time, which is an ambitious thing to ask of one small white flower. And it means something else too, something older, carried up from warmer countries where the orange tree flowers and fruits at once. It means a bride. Within a few years, because of this wreath, it will mean nothing else. Brides who cannot afford the hothouse will wear wax orange blossom, sold by the sprig, and after the wedding the wax sprigs will be kept under glass domes on parlour mantelpieces for the rest of the marriage. Little white flowers that never open and never die, which as a metaphor for Victorian matrimony you may make of what you will. At your throat goes the one large jewel of the day, and it is not a state possession. It is a sapphire brooch ringed with diamonds, and Albert gave it to you yesterday, and that is why it is worn today, over your heart, outranking every crown you own. The veil, Honiton again, months of some lacemaker's eyesight, goes on last, pinned back from your face, because you have decided the crowds and the congregation, and above all, Albert will see your face today. You look at the whole assembly in the long glass. Satin, lace, flowers, sapphire, and somewhere in the building a clock strikes, and Miss Skerritt permits herself one exhale through the nose, which from Miss Skerritt is a standing ovation. Hold on to that veil, by the way. Set it gently at the back of your mind and leave it there. It has one more appearance to make, and it is 61 years away. Now, the bridesmaids, because someone has to carry the train, and this is where the morning develops its one engineering problem. There are 12 of them, 12 train bearers, the unmarried daughters of the nobility, selected with the care other monarchs give to cabinet appointments, each one in white satin with white roses, in dresses you had a hand in designing yourself, because you have views about how this procession should look, and the procession is going to look like spring walking through winter. A dozen girls in white and roses moving through a February downpour into candlelight. The difficulty is mathematical. The train, magnificent as it is 6 yards long. 6 yards is 18 feet. 12 girls sharing 18 feet of satin works out at 18 inches of train per girl, which is not a length of fabric so much as a rumour of one, and it means the 12 of them must process down the aisle packed shoulder to shoulder, taking tiny synchronized steps, each holding her scrap of hem, trying to look serene while operating as a single 24-legged organism. One of the 12 wrote afterwards, with the weary precision of a girl who has spent an afternoon being trodden on, that they were obliged to walk practically in one another's arms. Nobody in the chapel will notice. From the pews it will look like floating. That is the great law of weddings, then and now. Serenity above the waterline, frantic paddling below, and the paddling is done by bridesmaids. For their trouble, each of the 12 will receive a present from you, a little brooch in the shape of an eagle, set with turquoise, designed to your own sketch. 12 eagles for 12 girls, several of which will still exist in collections nearly 2 centuries later, which is a better survival rate than the marriages of several people attending this wedding, but that is an observation for another hour of the night. The clock strikes again, the carriages are at the door, and the rain, with a fine sense of drama, has decided to keep raining. Time to go and be seen. To understand what happens next, you have to understand what royal weddings were like before this one, and the answer is, they were like board meetings, held at night. For over a century, the weddings of British royalty had taken place in the evening, indoors, in private chapels and drawing rooms, by candlelight, in front of the smallest workable number of important people. There was no procession worth the name, no crowd, no public anything. The theory was simple. A royal wedding was not a celebration. It was a transaction, a treaty with a dinner attached, and you do not sell tickets to a treaty. The bride and groom had frequently met only days before. The public found out it had happened the way the public finds out about most administrative matters, afterwards in print. Your own father, for that matter, was married to your mother in a shared ceremony with his own brother and his brother's bride. 2 middle-aged princes and 2 princesses processed through in one sitting, like a sale, which tells you everything about how much of a celebration these occasions were understood to be. And this morning, in the rain, you are throwing all of that away. Your wedding is happening at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in daylight. Such daylight as February is prepared to offer. And between this palace and that chapel you are going to travel through the open streets, at walking pace, past everybody. This was your decision, and it is hard to overstate how new it is. You are inventing, on this soaked Monday, the thing we now consider obvious, the idea that a royal wedding belongs, at least visually, to the public, that the bride is to be seen, that the crowd is part of the ceremony, and the crowd has voted with its boots. They are standing in the parks in weather you would not send a dog out in, tens of thousands of them, hats ruined, cheering every carriage that moves, climbing the trees along the route for a sightline, and discovering that a February tree in a gale is a poor grandstand. When your carriage finally rolls out of the palace gates, the sound that comes off the parks is not polite. It is a roar, wet and happy and enormous, rolling along the route with you like weather of its own, and inside the carriage, a 20-year-old in white satin and somebody else's year of lace is being driven at walking pace through a wall of sound, seen, actually seen, by more of her own people in 20 minutes than had personally laid eyes on any previous monarch of England in a reign. They see the white dress. Remember that tomorrow every newspaper in the country will describe it, and within months the fashion plates will carry it to Paris and New York, and every girl who reads those descriptions now has one image, one specific image, of what a bride at the absolute summit of the world looks like, and she is not wearing cloth of silver and a crown. She is wearing white satin and flowers, which is an outfit that can be imitated, at some level, by nearly anyone. A crown cannot be copied. A white dress can. That is the accident at the heart of tonight. By dressing down, the Queen accidentally issued a pattern, and the whole world has been sewing from it ever since. The chapel, when you reach it, is the opposite of the street. Small, warm, golden, and stuffed to the panelling with the aristocracy of exactly one political party. Here is a fact they leave off the commemorative plates. The guest list of the most famous wedding of the century was, by any reasonable description, a party rally. You are, at 20, a ferocious political partisan. Your beloved Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, is a Whig. Your court is Whig. Your friendships are Whig. And when the invitations went out for this wedding, the opposition discovered that being a Tory was, for the purposes of the 10th of February, roughly equivalent to not existing. Of the great Tory names of England, only a handful were asked at all. The Duke of Wellington, the most famous living Englishman, the victor of Waterloo, made the list, and the general understanding was that he made it the way the weather makes it into a picnic, because there was no keeping him out. A wedding, the thinking went, was a private family occasion, and this family, just now, was Whig. The newspapers noticed. The Tories certainly noticed. You did not care, which is the most 20-year-old thing about the whole day, and one of the last times in your reign you will be allowed to indulge it. Inside, the Chapel Royal is doing its best. It is genuinely small, a Tudor room dressed up in crimson and gold, with galleries packed to the rails, and everyone who is anyone, in the Whig sense of anyone, crammed into it in velvet and diamonds and feathers, producing between them a glitter that the candles multiply and a temperature the February outside can do nothing about. Trumpets announce each procession. Albert goes in ahead of you, in the scarlet uniform of a British field marshal, a rank he has held for approximately 5 minutes in career terms, with the Star of the Garter on his chest, walking between his father and his brother, being looked at by a chapel full of strangers who are all, behind their fans and orders of precedence, asking the same 2 questions. Is he as handsome as they say? And what exactly is he for? The first question gets answered immediately, because he is. The second question is going to take about 20 years, and he will answer it so thoroughly that the country will name half its public buildings after him. But nobody in the galleries knows that yet. Today he is a beautiful foreign 20-year-old with no money, no kingdom, and no job description, marrying the most powerful woman on earth in a borrowed uniform, and every eye on him knows it, and so does he. Then the trumpets go again, and it is you, and the 12 in white and roses gather up their 18 inches each, and the doors open, and the entire golden room stands and turns, and you walk into the sound of the anthem with your heart going like the rain on the roof, and somewhere in the middle of all that satin there is just a girl walking toward just a boy, which is the one part of this whole apparatus that has never changed for anyone. And now the words, because the words are where this wedding quietly becomes astonishing. You had choices about the words. You are the head of the church whose service this is. Adjustments could have been made, precedents could have been invented, Lawyers could have been consulted, and everyone rather expected they would be, because the service of the Church of England asks the bride to make a promise that sits very oddly on a reigning queen. It asks her to obey. You kept it, deliberately. You considered the matter and announced that you wished to be married, in your own words, as a woman, not as a queen. And so, at about 1 o'clock, in front of the assembled peerage, the supreme governor of the Church of England, commander-in-chief of the largest navy on earth, a woman who outranks every human being in the building, and most of the ones alive, promises out loud to love, cherish and obey a penniless younger son from a duchy the size of a county. There is a ripple through the galleries at the word. Of course there is. Half the room finds it touching and the other half finds it alarming, and the newspapers will chew on it for weeks, and here is the strange, tangled truth of it. The promise is both completely sincere and completely impossible. She means it, and she can never keep it, because the Constitution will not let her. He will spend their whole marriage discovering what that means. Because look at Albert's side of this ledger. While the ring goes on, he is not becoming king. There is no such thing as becoming king by marriage in England, and Parliament, suspicious of foreign princes on general principle, has spent the winter making the point in the most English way available, which is money. The customary allowance for a queen's husband had run to £50,000 a year. Parliament looked at Albert and voted him 30. They then declined to give him a peerage and spent weeks bickering about where he was allowed to stand and walk in official processions, which sounds petty because it was, and the sum of it is this. The young man at the altar is acquiring a wife who must, by law, rule over him. A country that has just docked his pay before his first day, and a job that does not exist, in a language he is still polishing, at 20 years old. And he says his half of the vows in careful English, and he means his too. And between the two of them, on that altar, in front of the Whig party in its Sunday best, they are promising things the law has already made impossible in both directions. She cannot obey. He cannot lead. They will spend 21 years working out what to do instead, and the answer they find, mostly, is each other. The register is signed. The trumpets and the bells take over, and the abominable weather outside gets the one thing it has waited for all day, which is a married queen coming out onto the steps to a roar you can feel through stone, and the carriages, and the wet ride home, and every church bell in London going at once, and in the middle of it all, packed in satin, with a new gold ring under her glove, a girl who woke up this morning making lists. Back at the palace, they are lighting the candles on something enormous. It is time to talk about the cake. The wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace is called a breakfast because of a law we will get to later in the night, and it is a breakfast the way a coronation is a hat. The rooms are full of everyone who was in the chapel, plus everyone who was offended not to be. The tables run to gold plate, and at the centre of the whole operation, on its own table, under its own scrutiny, sits the cake. The cake weighs £300. Let me say that again, slowly, because it is a sentence that improves with repetition. The principal wedding cake of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert weighs £300, which is to say it weighs as much as 2 grown men, and it measures around 9 feet in circumference, which is to say that if you wanted to hug it, you would need 2 friends. It is English plum cake, dark and dense as geology, iced white, and on top of it stands a sculpture garden. There is a figure of Britannia, blessing the happy couple. There are the happy couple themselves, rendered in classical dress, which is to say not dressed as themselves, because even the cake understands that this wedding is partly a performance of something older and grander than 2 20-year-olds. And down at their feet, and this is the detail I would protect with my life, there is a little dog, a small sculpted dog, included to signify fidelity, gazing up at the allegorical newlyweds with sugar devotion. £300 of cake, the government of an empire in the next room, and somebody in the confectionery kitchens took the time to make a little dog, and history has thanked that person by photographing everything else. This is not even the only cake. There are other lesser cakes, a whole squadron of them, because the appetite this wedding must feed is not measured in guests. Slices are being cut and packed into little boxes, and the boxes matter. A box of this cake is not food. It is a relic. Slices will go out to courtiers, to officials, to people. The palace owes a favour, and the recipients, knowing exactly what they have, will mostly not eat it. They will keep it. They will keep it in drawers and cabinets, boxed and labelled, for the rest of their lives, and their children will keep it, and their grandchildren, and here is how thoroughly the Victorians won this particular bet with time. Pieces of this exact cake still exist today. They surface at auction every few years, brown, fossilised, faintly terrifying, still in the original boxes, and in 2016 a single slice sold for about £1,500. A piece of cake from this breakfast outlasted the empire it was baked in, outlasted the dynasty's name, outlasted the century, and is currently appreciating faster than most investment portfolios. Fruitcake, it turns out, was the blockchain of the 19th century, and the Victorians knew it, which is why wedding cake was fruitcake in the first place. It is the only cake that agrees to become an heirloom. You, the bride, eat almost none of it. You have a breakfast to survive, hands to take, a mother to be gracious to, and a going-away outfit waiting upstairs, because the day, incredibly, still is not finished with you. In the afternoon you change out of the satin and the ear of lace, and Miss Skerritt dresses you in the travelling clothes, white again, trimmed with swansdown, soft as the inside of a cloud, and you and Albert climb into a carriage and set off for Windsor, for the honeymoon, with the whole soggy city cheering you out of town. The drive takes hours in the winter dark, and it is not a private drive, because nothing today is private. Every town along the road has turned out. There are lamps and flags and people standing on walls in the rain, shouting themselves hoarse at a carriage they can barely see, and at the end of it, at Windsor, the boys of Eton College are waiting in the dark to roar the two of you up the hill to the castle. Hundreds of teenage boys in top hats bellowing their heads off for a bride, which is possibly the most touching, ridiculous image the whole day produces. And now, the honeymoon, and the honeymoon is 3 days long, and the reason it is 3 days long is the best marriage document of the century. Albert, back when all this was being arranged, had written to you assuming the two of you would do what newlyweds of rank did, which is disappear into the countryside for weeks, alone, away from everything. It is the one assumption in the whole enterprise where he forgot who he was marrying. The reply he received from his loving bride-to-be is a masterpiece of the affectionate steamroller school of correspondence. "You are forgetting, my dearest love," she tells him, in effect, "that I am the sovereign, and that business can stop and wait for nothing. Parliament is sitting. 2 or 3 days is already as much as she can be away from London, and that was that." The most powerful woman in the world explained to her future husband, tenderly, before the wedding, that their honeymoon would be scheduled around the government of the empire, and it was. 3 days. Every married person listening who has ever cut a holiday short for work may now feel seen across a distance of nearly 2 centuries, and every partner who has ever received that news may spare a thought for Albert, who at least got a castle out of it. But do not feel too sorry for anybody, because the 3 days themselves, by every account including hers, were the happiest of her young life, and her account is the one history got because she wrote it all down. She wrote everything down, her whole life, pages a day, and the wedding night entry is famous for the sheer force of its underlining. What she records, for the benefit of posterity and to the lasting embarrassment of her descendants, is that she had never spent such an evening, that his kindness and affection were beyond everything, and the never is underlined, and I will leave the matter there as she did not. She also records, that first evening, a headache. A sick headache, in fact, bad enough that she spent part of her own wedding night lying on a sofa. But, she notes, she lay on the sofa, and he sat on a footstool beside her, and held her, and the entry makes clear that as far as she was concerned, the sofa, the headache, the footstool and the young man attached to it constituted the finest evening in the history of evenings, which is its own quiet lesson about weddings, from the woman who accidentally invented the modern one. The day is pageantry. But the marriage is somebody sitting on a footstool next to your headache. The morning after tells you the rest. The couple were up and out early, walking together on the terrace in the winter air, visibly delighted with themselves, and this scandalized exactly the people you would expect it to scandalize. The great court diarist of the age, a man named Greville, who missed nothing and approved of little, noted the early hour with alarm and remarked, to anyone who would listen, that this was no way for a bridal night to be conducted, and that it was certainly not the way to provide the country with a Prince of Wales. He need not have worried, 9 royal children would arrive over the next 17 years, a Princess Royal before the first anniversary and a Prince of Wales before the second, and Greville would have to find something else to disapprove of, which, being Greville, he managed by lunchtime. And her journal, in those first days at Windsor, records the small things, and the small things are the best things in the whole archive. "My dearest Albert," she writes, "put on my stockings for me." I went in and saw him shave, a great delight for me. The Queen of England, sitting in a dressing room watching a young man scrape soap off his chin, recording it that evening as one of the wonders of the age. 2 20-year-olds who barely know each other, who were arranged at each other by an uncle, who married in front of 400 political appointments, discovering, in a cold castle in February, that they actually genuinely catastrophically like each other. It is the plot twist nobody planned. The treaty fell in love. On the 3rd day, as promised, the boxes caught up with them. The red dispatch boxes, the papers of state, the business that stops for nothing, and here is the last picture from the honeymoon, and it is a picture of the whole reign to come. She sits at the desk, because the papers are hers, the signature is hers, the crown is hers. And Albert, the husband who was promised obedience by a wife the Constitution forbids to give it, finds his first job in his new country. He stands beside the desk, and when she signs, he blots the signatures. That is the position. Handsome, brilliant, 20 years old, and holding the blotting paper. It will take him years of patience to turn that into a partnership that runs half the modernisation of Britain, and he will do it. But it starts there, at Windsor, on day 3 of the marriage. The Queen signing, the husband blotting, both of them ridiculously in love, and neither of them with the faintest idea what to do about the arrangement. The honeymoon ends, the carriage goes back to London, and now the story leaves the palace and goes out into the world through every front door in the country, because while these two settle into married life, something they set off together is spreading like weather. Everyone, everywhere, wants that wedding. Here is what a wedding looked like before that Monday, for nearly everybody, and I want you to picture it clearly, because it is about to vanish. A bride got married in her best dress. That is the whole custom. Not a wedding dress, a best dress, the one she already owned or the one new dress the occasion could justify, and it was any colour at all. Brown was popular because brown was sensible. Blue was popular and considered lucky. Grey, plum, green, a good sturdy patterned wool for a farmer's daughter. Red if that is what you had, black if that is what you had, because the dress had a long life ahead of it after the wedding. At church, at christenings, at other people's weddings, possibly at funerals, a dress that could only be worn once was not a luxury most people had ever imagined wanting. It would be like buying a carriage for one journey. Royal brides and the very rich went the other way and got married in metal, more or less, cloth of silver and cloth of gold, stiff with gems, dresses that announced a treasury rather than a bride. White existed, here and there, for the occasional very grand or very fashionable girl, but it was one option among many, and everyone understood the main thing about it, which is that it was madness. White could not be washed, not really, not in a world of coal smoke and street mud and tallow candles. White was a dress with no future, and then the most famous 20-year-old on earth wore white satin and Devon lace in front of the world, and the newspapers described every inch of it, and the fashion plates carried it into every parlour in Britain and America, and the whole logic flipped upside down. Because if white is a dress with no future, then a white wedding says something no amount of silver ever could. It says, "My family can afford a dress with no future." It says we have money we do not need back. The impossibility was the point. And so it begins. Within months, first the aristocracy, then the merchant families who copy the aristocracy, then the professional families who copy the merchants, each layer of society straining a little harder than the one above it to put its daughters in white. And the poor bride still marries sensibly in her best dress for another 2 generations. But now she knows, and her daughter knows, exactly what a real wedding is supposed to look like. It looks like the Queen. And then comes my favourite sentence in this entire story. 9 years after the wedding, in 1849, the great American women's magazine Godey's Lady's Book pronounced upon the question of bridal colour, and it declared, with total serene authority, that custom has decided, from the earliest ages, that white is the most fitting hue for a bride. From the earliest ages, the custom was 9 years old. There were housemaids in London with aprons older than the ancient tradition of the white wedding, and here is a magazine assuring several 100,000 readers that it stretches back beyond memory. This is how tradition actually works, by the way, and it is worth carrying with you through the rest of the night. A thing does not need to be old to feel eternal. It only needs to be lovely enough that nobody wants to remember it having a beginning. And once white was eternal, it needed a meaning grander than laundry, so the magazine supplied one, and the meaning they chose was purity, innocence, the unspotted bride, and that story got so big and so solemn that within a lifetime, brides were being judged against it. The colour that began as a display case for lace ended up as a moral examination, which is the single most Victorian sentence I will say all night. The flowers went the same way, only stranger. After the wedding, orange blossom was not a flower anymore. It was the flower, the official badge of bridehood, and demand did what demand does. Real orange blossom, remember, barely exists in England. It has to be coaxed out of hothouses stem by stem in defiance of the entire British climate, and no grocer's daughter in Leeds was ever going to carry it. So industry solved the problem, the way this century solves everything, with manufacturing. Wax orange blossom. Little sprays of white wax flowers moulded and wired and sold by the sprig in every town, so that any bride at all, whatever her purse, could be married under the same flower as the Queen. And because they were wax, because they could not wilt, they did not end with the wedding. They were kept. All over the country, for the rest of the century, on parlour mantelpieces, under glass domes, sat these small white arrangements, the bride's wax blossom, dusted weekly, displayed for decades, a little sealed museum of the best day of somebody's life, sitting in the room where she poured tea for the rest of it. The royal family, meanwhile, grew its own version of this, and theirs was alive, and it is still alive, and this is one of those details that connects that world to yours down a single green thread. A few years into the marriage, Albert's grandmother gave Victoria a posy that included a sprig of myrtle, the old Mediterranean emblem of love and marriage, and the sprig was planted in the garden at Osborne, their seaside house on the Isle of Wight, where it grew into a bush and then into a hedge. And when the royal daughters began to marry, a sprig of Osborne myrtle went into the bouquet, and then it simply never stopped. Elizabeth II carried Osborne myrtle, Diana carried it, Catherine carried it, Meghan carried it. Every one of them walked down the aisle, holding a cutting from the same plant, a living piece of 1845, still growing quietly beside the sea on the Isle of Wight, still being clipped for weddings. The world's most patient bridesmaid. If you want a definition of dynasty that has nothing to do with crowns, that hedge is it. Now, about the clocks, because I promised you a law, and it is a genuinely strange one. For the whole first half of Victoria's reign, and long before it, you could not legally be married in England in the afternoon. The Church's rules, backed by the force of law for ordinary weddings, confined the ceremony to the hours between 8 in the morning and 12 noon. Miss the window, and there was no wedding that day. The reasoning was old and mostly boiled down to daylight and decency. A marriage was a public act, to be done openly, soberly, in the morning, before witnesses who had not yet been near a tavern, in a church whose doors stood open, which is why every wedding in every Victorian novel happens in the morning, why brides dressed at dawn, why the whole day had the shape it had, and why, if the groom's train was late or the licence was wrong or the ring was lost, you did not have a delay, you had a countdown, with the vicar checking his watch against the actual law of the land. Not until 1886 was the boundary pushed to 3 in the afternoon, and evening weddings, the candlelit kind we find romantic, remained impossible for ordinary couples into living memory, and that single rule explains a phrase you have heard your whole life without questioning. If the marriage must happen by noon, then the party after it lands at midday, and a meal eaten at midday after a morning of fasting, nerves and churches, in the logic of the age, breakfast, the wedding breakfast. It was never about eggs. It was about a legal system that put every bride in the country on a morning deadline, and a meal named with perfect Victorian literal-mindedness, and the phrase then outlived the law by a century and a half, so that people still say wedding breakfast today about parties that begin at 6 in the evening, a small fossil of canon law sitting in the middle of the language, and hardly anyone knows it is there. Getting to the church on time was, in other words, statute. And before you could even start the clock, the church had to be told, and the parish had to be told. 3 Sundays running, with the reading of the banns, your names announced out loud to the whole congregation, 3 separate times, so that anyone who knew a reason against the marriage had their chance to stand up in public and say so. Imagine that today. Imagine your engagement being read aloud to your entire neighbourhood on 3 consecutive weekends, with a formal invitation for objections. The Victorians considered this ordinary, sensible consumer protection, and honestly, given some of the bridegrooms circulating in this economy, it occasionally was. Unless, of course, you ran, because there was one famous hole in the whole legal fence, and it was called Scotland. Scottish marriage law was older, looser, and magnificently unbothered. No bans, no licence, no parental consent for a girl over 16, and for much of the era no fussing about mornings either. All a couple needed to do was declare themselves married before witnesses on Scottish soil, and the first Scottish soil available on the Great Road North was a village called Gretna Green, just over the border, where an entire cottage industry of instant marriage had grown up, conducted, in the most famous version, by the village blacksmith over his anvil, on the reasoning that he was in the joining trade already. For generations, every scandalous elopement in England ended, or hoped to end, in a chaise rattling toward Gretna with an angry father half a day behind it, and every reader of every novel knew exactly what it meant when a young lady could not be found and the fast horses were gone. The law tightened eventually, and required the runaways to actually live in Scotland for 3 weeks before the anvil could save them, which took most of the romance and all of the urgency out of it. But the name never lost its glow. Gretna Green was what the whole rulebook looked like from underneath. Proof that if you build a fence of bans and deadlines and permissions around the altar, some fraction of the customers will simply go around the end of it, and the village at the end of the fence will do very nicely out of the traffic. And then there is the cake, which by now you will not be surprised to learn was not really food either. The cake was infrastructure. It was fruit cake, always, dense plum cake under white icing, and the choice was practical before it was anything else. Fruit cake is the only cake that keeps, and this cake had work to do long after the wedding. Slices went into boxes for guests and for absent friends, and the boxes travelled because a piece of wedding cake was a token of the day that you could hold in your hand, and people kept them, sometimes forever, as we have seen, sometimes at £1,500 at auction. At grander weddings there was not even one cake, but several, a main cake and smaller ones besides, sometimes a bridesmaid's cake and a groomsman's cake, an entire cake economy on one table. But the best part, the part I have been saving, is what unmarried women did with their slice. You did not eat your slice. Everyone knew you did not eat your slice. You took it home and, in the fullest version of the ritual, you passed it through the bride's own wedding ring first, and then you put it under your pillow and you slept on it, because a slice of wedding cake under the pillow made you dream of your future husband. That was the technology. Some girls refined the method and wore the slice in their left stocking overnight instead. This was not fringe superstition, whispered at the edges of things. This was ordinary, respectable, done with a laugh that was not entirely a laugh, in good households, for generations. All over the empire, on any given night after a wedding, hundreds of sensible young women in nightgowns were lying with their heads on crumbling fruitcake, eyes shut, waiting to be shown a face. The dry cleaning bills alone do not bear thinking about, and if you are now asking whether it worked, then congratulations, you have understood the 19th century. Of course it worked. Everybody dreamed of somebody, and a dream can be steered by a hopeful heart better than any algorithm since, and the pillow method had one advantage over the apps, which is that at the very worst, you woke up with cake. So there is the kit, assembled piece by piece in the years after that rainy Monday. The white dress, the blossom, the morning deadline, the breakfast, the boxed and pillowed cake, one royal wedding, refracted through a million ordinary ones. And the wedding day was only the last page of it. Around the day itself, the age built an entire preliminary world, a whole obstacle course a couple had to run before anyone was allowed near an altar, and it is worth walking that course once, slowly, because almost nothing on it would be legal, thinkable, or survivable today. The course began years before the church door, with courtship, and Victorian courtship was conducted on one great governing principle, which is that the two people concerned were never, under any circumstances, to be left alone together. A respectable young man called at the house, and sat in the parlour, and made conversation with the young lady in the presence of her mother, her aunt, a visiting cousin, and frequently a piano, and that was courtship. If the couple walked out, somebody walked with them, a chaperone, a younger sister bribed into service, somebody, because a young woman's reputation was a cliff with no fence at the top, and the whole of polite society had agreed to solve the problem by making privacy structurally impossible. Couples fell in love anyway, obviously, because human beings can fall in love through a letterbox if required, and the age developed an entire secondary technology for it. The language of flowers, the angle of a fan, the pressure of a gloved hand during a dance, an entire grammar of longing conducted in full view of the room at a volume no chaperone could hear. When a man's intentions ripened, he did not, in the first instance, necessarily raise the matter with the woman he intended them toward. He spoke to her father. This was not a charming formality the way it survives today, a nervous dinner and a blessing. It was an audit. The father's business was to establish, in plain figures, what the young man earned, what he expected to earn, what he owed, and what settlements his family would make, because a Victorian marriage was, among its other properties, the single largest financial transaction most families would ever conduct, and no prudent father handed over a daughter without inspecting the books. A suitor could adore, and be adored, and be refused flatly on arithmetic, and everyone, including the heartbroken parties, would agree that arithmetic was a perfectly honourable reason, because love in a house with no coal in it was understood to have a short life expectancy. And if the numbers did not add up yet, you waited. This is the part modern people find hardest to feel, the long engagement, not as romance, but as savings plan. A man was expected to keep his wife at something like the standard her father had kept her at, and until his salary could do it, there was no wedding, and so the respectable classes filled up with couples engaged for 2 years, 4 years, 7 years, writing weekly letters, seeing each other in supervised installments, while he inched up through the counting house and she embroidered linens for a household that existed so far only as a column of projected figures. There is a whole shelf of Victorian fiction about what that waiting did to people, and the fiction did not have to invent much. But here is the detail that tells you what an engagement actually was, underneath the flowers. It was a contract, and you could be sued for breaking it. The action was called breach of promise of marriage, and it was real law in real courts for the entire era and beyond. If a man proposed, was accepted, and then walked away, the jilted woman could take him to court and demand damages, for her wounded feelings, for her lost prospects, for the wasted years in which better offers had been turned aside, and juries, who were made up of fathers, awarded them with enthusiasm. These trials were public, and the newspapers adored them beyond measure, because the evidence was the love letters. Barristers stood up in open court and read out, slowly, with expression, every tender, ridiculous thing a defendant had ever committed to paper. My own darling, my little bird, count the days as I do, while the gallery snickered and the reporters transcribed, and the whole country read it over breakfast. Grown men settled out of court for serious sums specifically to keep their endearments out of the papers. So when you picture a Victorian gentleman on one knee, picture also the tiny lawyer standing behind him, because everyone in the room could see it. A proposal was a promise. The courts would enforce. An engagement was a liability with flowers on it, and my little bird was, potentially, Exhibit A. Once the question had been asked, and survived the audit, and the waiting had been served, the calendar took over, because around the wedding day itself, the Victorians maintained an entire invisible almanac of what you could and could not do, and they maintained it with a straight face. Start with the day of the week. There was a rhyme, and everyone's grandmother could recite it. Monday for wealth, Tuesday for health, Wednesday the best day of all, Thursday for losses, Friday for crosses, and Saturday no luck at all. Sit with that last part for a moment. Saturday, the day on which you almost certainly attended every wedding you have ever attended, was, to the Victorian mind, the one openly cursed day of the week, the day only the careless would choose, and the modern wedding industry is therefore built, from the foundations up, on the single least lucky day available. Nobody decided this on purpose. The Victorians married on weekday mornings because farms and shops could spare an hour then, and we marry on Saturdays because offices cannot. And somewhere between the two, the rhyme lost and the calendar won, which is how it usually goes. And yes, you may have noticed, the Queen herself was married on a Monday for wealth. On the whole, it delivered. The months had rules too. Marry in Lent, live to repent, so the whole late winter was effectively closed for business. May was worse. Marry in May, rue the day, said a superstition so old it predates Christianity, and respectable Victorian families genuinely steered their daughters around the month of May, which is why June, sitting there right after it, sweet-tempered and sunny and fully legal, became the great bridal month. And a June wedding is another thing you inherited from this calendar, without being told where it came from. In some counties, green was a forbidden colour for a bride, green being the colour of the fairies and of grass stains, neither of which a wedding wished to invoke. The proverb said, "Happy is the bride the sun shines on," which is worth remembering tonight mostly because it poured with rain on Victoria sideways, all day, and hers turned out to be the most famously happy royal marriage of the age, so the proverbs, like most forecasting, worked best when nobody checked. And toward the end of the century, the rhyme you already know starts appearing in print, the little packing list, something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. It arrives late, it arrives quietly, and it comes with a final line that has mostly fallen off in the retelling, and a sixpence in her shoe, because the luck needed funding, and generations of brides limped very slightly to the altar, with a small silver coin under one heel. The old thing tied you to your family, the new thing to your future. The borrowed thing, ideally borrowed from a happily married woman, was luck on loan, and the blue thing was fidelity, blue being constancy's colour long before anyone told you why. It is a checklist, a spell, and a shopping trip in one sentence, which is the entire Victorian relationship to magic. Superstition, yes, but organised, itemised, and achievable by tea time. The veil, for the record, is the one piece of the outfit older than all of it. Brides were veiling in ancient Rome in flame-coloured cloth 2,000 years before any of tonight's characters were born. The Victorians simply took the oldest prop in the theatre, bleached it white to match the new uniform, and then, being Victorians, wrapped it in a fresh layer of etiquette about modesty and mystery and the moment of unveiling. But under the lace, it is Rome. Every bride who lowers a veil is wearing the Mediterranean Bronze Age to a party, and it is somehow still the newest looking thing in the room. Then there were the presents, and the presents are where the Victorian wedding shows you its bookkeeping. At a respectable wedding breakfast, the gifts were not stacked politely out of sight. They were displayed. Laid out on tables, in the house, arranged for viewing like lots at an auction, and crucially, each gift was displayed with the card of the person who gave it. Walk the table, and you could read, in silver and linen and porcelain, exactly who valued this family, and at precisely what rate. The guests certainly read it. The mothers read it like scripture. Generosity became a spectator sport with published scores, and mean gifts were noted, and grand gifts were noted harder, and the whole table was a map of alliances, obligations, and grudges rendered in fish forks. At the great society weddings, the newspapers finished the job, printing entire columns listing the gifts and the givers, name by name, so that a marchioness in Yorkshire could check whether a countess in Kent had sent the young couple something appropriate, and the countess, knowing she would be checked, spent accordingly. If you have ever felt that modern weddings involve a certain amount of performance, some public accounting of who spent what and who showed up and how it all looked, be comforted. You are not living through a decline. You are living through a tradition, and at least nobody prints your gift list in the morning paper with your name against it. At the royal scale, the same machine simply ran larger. Royal couples received gifts by the hundred and by the thousand, from foreign courts, from cities, from regiments, from committees of ordinary subscribers who had clubbed together their shillings, and the halls were itemised and admired and reported until a royal wedding resembled, among its other functions, the ceremonial opening of the world's most sentimental warehouse. And then, at the exit of every modern wedding, there is one more inheritance waiting, and this one comes with a twist, because the wedding photograph that most sacred of documents, began its life as a fake. There are no photographs of Victoria and Albert's wedding. There could not be. In 1840, photography was a brand new laboratory marvel that needed its subjects to hold perfectly still for a small eternity, in strong light, and a chapel full of moving velvet at 1 o'clock on a wet February afternoon was as photographable as a dream. Whatever you think you have seen of that day is a painting. And yet there exists a famous photograph, reproduced 1,000 times, captioned in books and on posters as the wedding photograph of Victoria and Albert. She stands in white with flowers in her hair. He sits beside her in court dress, and it is real, and it is them, and it was taken in 1854. 14 years after the wedding, 8 children into the marriage, the two of them, in their mid-30s, dressed up and posed in a photographer's version of a moment no camera had been able to catch, and the world has been happily mislabeling it ever since. And they were not alone, because this is what the first generation of photograph people did. All over the country, couples who had married before the camera reached them, or whose wedding morning had simply been too busy and too dim for an exposure, went to the studio afterwards, sometimes years afterwards, climbed back into the wedding clothes, the dress let out a little, the flowers waxed by now, and had the day recorded retroactively. The albums of the era are full of these pictures, solemn couples frozen in their finery, and no caption tells you whether you are looking at a bride of that morning or a wife of 8 years performing her own history. By the 1860s, with faster plates and the little carte de visite portraits selling by the million, the camera finally got quick enough to attend the actual day, and the wedding photograph as you know it was born, and it has been organising weddings ever since, determining where people stand and when they smile, and how long the hungry guests wait for dinner while the couple is marched around a garden. But it is worth remembering, whenever you see a stiff Victorian couple in wedding dress gazing down the lens, that the whole institution began with reenactment. The first wedding photographs were not memories. They were memories the way a statue is a person. The Victorians, who could not photograph the moment, photographed the meaning instead. And honestly, looking at what the wedding photograph became, you could argue nobody has done anything different since. So now you have the whole engine assembled. The dress, the flowers, the deadline, the breakfast, the cake, the gifts with their scorecards, the photograph with its little lie. One wedding built it, and 1,000,000 weddings ran on it, and it should all feel cozy and complete. And it would, if the family at the top of it had simply lived happily ever after. They did not. The couple on the cake had 9 children, and every one of those children was, from the hour of its christening, a diplomatic asset with a wedding attached. And the mother who invented the white wedding was about to spend the rest of the century attending them. She would attend almost every one of them in black, but not the first. The first one happened while the world was still golden, and it began, years before the altar, on a hillside in Scotland, with a 14-year-old girl, a Prussian prince, and a sprig of white heather. You have to picture the royal nursery of the 1840s and 50s as two things at once, and both of them are true, and they never stop being true at the same time. It is a real nursery, with 9 actual children in it, measles and skinned knees and a mother who sketches them sleeping, and a father who flies kites with them and builds them a miniature cottage to learn housekeeping in. And it is also, simultaneously, the most valuable diplomatic portfolio in Europe. 9 future alliances learning to walk, and everybody knows it, including, eventually, the children. A prince in this world is a treaty that eats. A princess is a border, waiting to be drawn. And the 2 people running this nursery, who married each other for love, more or less, against all the odds of their world, I will spend 20 years scouting the courts of Europe for suitable matches for their children, the way other parents scout schools, because that is what loving your children looks like at this altitude. The Almanach de Gotha, the great directory of European royalty, sits on the desk like a seed catalogue. Eligibility is a science. Protestant, of decent health, of sufficient rank, of useful geography. Love is hoped for, sincerely, but it is hoped for inside a shortlist, and the shortlist is drawn in ink. Nowhere did the 2 truths run closer together than with the eldest, and the eldest is where the weddings begin. Vicky, the Princess Royal, firstborn, quickest of the 9, her father's pupil and her father's image, reading philosophy for fun, fluent in 3 languages, and marked out from the cradle for the biggest project her parents could imagine: Prussia. The idea, and it was Albert's great idea, was that a clever, liberal, English-raised princess planted at the heart of stiff military Prussia might, in time, gently steer the whole kingdom toward constitutional, parliamentary, English ways, and change the future of Europe from the inside of a marriage. No pressure at all, then, on the small girl doing her lessons. The chosen instrument was Prince Frederick William of Prussia, called Fritz, tall, kind, mustached, heir eventually to the Prussian throne, and 10 years older than Vicky. In September of 1855, Fritz came to visit the family at Balmoral, in the Scottish Highlands. Vicky was 14, he was 23, and he had come, with the full knowledge of both sets of parents, to have a look at her, in the way of this world, and what happened next everyone involved would retell for the rest of their lives. Out riding with the family, on a Highland hillside, Fritz spotted a sprig of white heather, the lucky kind, the rare kind, and he picked it, and he handed it to the 14-year-old beside him, and with that small white signal, as the family put it afterwards, the confidential communication had occurred. He asked her parents for her before he left. The parents, delighted, imposed the one condition that makes the whole story bearable, which is time. Nothing would be said to the world, and nothing would happen at all, until she was 17. So Vicky finished her childhood engaged, which she knew, to a man she thought wonderful, which by all accounts he genuinely was, and the two of them wrote letters and waited while she grew up into her own wedding. She turned 17. And then the Prussians made their move, and the Prussians discovered what the rest of Europe already knew about the bride's mother. Berlin assumed, naturally, that the wedding would be held in Berlin. Prussian princes married in Prussia. It was custom, it was protocol, it was self-respect, and the Prussian court communicated as much to London with the serene confidence of a great power stating the obvious. The reply they received has been delighting historians ever since. The Queen of England informed Berlin, in writing, that whatever the custom of Prussian princes might be, the question was settled, and it was not settled their way, because it was not every day that one married the eldest daughter of the Queen of England. The wedding would be in England. There was no answer to that, and none was attempted. It is the single most quotable sentence the royal marriage market ever produced, a whole geopolitics in one flick of the pen, and underneath the grandeur you can hear something plainer and older, which is a mother declining, absolutely, to be elbowed out of her own daughter's wedding day. So, on the 25th of January, 1858, in the same chapel royal at St. James's where her parents had stood 18 years before, under the same kind of winter light, Vicky was married in white satin and Honiton lace, moss and myrtle in her flowers, and that myrtle matters. It was cut from the Osborne bush, the first royal bouquet ever to carry it, the start of the tradition that runs unbroken to the bouquets you have watched on television. The mother of the bride, by her own account, spent the day in a state considerably worse than the bride, which would become a pattern. The bride herself, 17, sailed through it. And notice what the mother had done, because it is quietly one of the most touching arrangements of the whole reign. She had rebuilt her own wedding around her daughter, piece by piece. The same chapel, deliberately chosen. The same white satin and the same Devon lace on the dress. The same flock of attendants in white. The same winter month. The same rooms. The same drive through the same streets to the same cheering. Even the same short honeymoon at Windsor. A couple of days, naturally, because some family traditions are apparently non-negotiable. 18 years earlier, a 20-year-old had improvised all of it in a fortnight of rain, and now, the first time one of her children stood at an altar, she reached for every piece of it again. Exactly. Like a woman repeating a spell that had worked, the white wedding was 18 years old, and inside this one family it was already liturgy. It is the same instinct you have seen at every wedding you have ever attended: the borrowed veil, the mother's dress taken in, the grandmother's ring, the human refusal to let a good day happen only once, performed here at the scale of a state occasion, with the whole country watching and no one in the chapel but the mother quite understanding what was being repeated. 10,000 small perfections of protocol came off without incident. London illuminated. The crowds roared for the girl the way they had once roared for her mother, and for 2 days the whole thing was simply, uncomplicatedly golden, the system working exactly as designed, the love match and the alliance in one white dress. And then came Gravesend, because the thing about marrying a daughter to a foreign throne, the thing the cheering makes easy to forget, is that at the end of the wedding, the daughter leaves. On the 2nd of February, a week married, Vicky went down to Gravesend on the Thames, where the ship waited to take her to Prussia. It was raw February weather. The town had turned out anyway, the pier and the streets packed, flowers thrown in front of the 17-year-old the whole way, and at the water's edge came the goodbyes, and they were terrible, and everybody who was there wrote about them. She clung to her father. Albert, the calm one, the managed one, held his eldest child, his best student, the person in the family most like him, and walked her onto the ship, and afterwards, in the letter he sent chasing her across the sea, he told her that his heart had been very full at that parting, which, translated out of Albert, is a man saying he broke. She stood at the rail crying as England went out of sight. She was 17 years old, she had been married 8 days, and she would live in Prussia, with visits, for the rest of her life. The plan had worked perfectly. That was the price printed on the bottom of the plan. The price everyone had always known was there, and knowing, it turns out, helps almost not at all. They wrote to each other, mother and daughter, several times a week, thousands upon thousands of letters over the decades, an entire second life conducted in ink. And if tonight has a quiet underside, it is this, the great royal wedding, the thing the crowds cheer and the bakers build for, was always, for the family inside it, partly a farewell. The white dress was also a leaving outfit. Every mother who has ever cried at a wedding for reasons she could not fully name has been crying about the same thing Gravesend was about, which is that a wedding is a door, and doors work in both directions, and the guests only ever look at one side of it. For 3 more years the family stood at the top of the golden world. And then, in December of 1861, the golden world ended in a fortnight. Albert had been tired for months, overworked for years, the man who blotted the signatures having long since become the man who drafted half of them. In late November, he took to his bed with what the doctors of the day called typhoid fever, and the household told itself the things households tell themselves. And on the 14th of December, at Windsor, with his wife beside him, he died. He was 42 years old. They had been married 21 years. I am not going to spend long here, because this is a night for sleep, and the room we have just entered is the saddest one in the building. But you cannot understand a single wedding that follows, not one, without standing in it for a moment. Victoria did not recover. That is not a figure of speech. It is the plain biographical record. The woman who woke up on that rainy February morning in 1840, the girl of the sapphire brooch and the underlined journal, went into black on the 14th of December, 1861, and stayed in black for the remaining 40 years of her life. Every dress, every bonnet, every glove black for 4 decades. The court went into mourning with her and, in significant ways, never fully came out. And a whole industry followed the court, because this is the century of manufacturing. Black crepe by the mile, jet jewellery, mourning stationery with black borders, an entire national economy of grief, with the widow of Windsor at the top of it like a figure on a very different cake. Here is the fact to carry into the rest of the night. Every royal wedding still to come, and there are many, every white dress, every orange blossom, every peal of bells, now happens inside that black house. The woman who invented the white wedding will attend every single one of them as a widow, and the collisions between those two facts, between the white dress and the black one in the same room, are about to produce some of the strangest scenes in the whole history of weddings. The first collision came just 7 months after his death. There was a wedding on the calendar that could not reasonably be moved, a promised daughter and a waiting bridegroom, and so it went ahead. In July of 1862, not in a chapel, not in an abbey, but in the dining room of a country house, and it is remembered by the people who were there as the saddest wedding of the century. It was Alice's. Alice was the 3rd child, the 2nd daughter, the gentle one, the family's nurse. When anyone was ill, it was Alice who sat with them, and through the awful December of 1861 it had been Alice, 18 years old, who ran the sick room, managed her collapsing mother, and held the household upright with both hands while her father went out like a lamp. She was already engaged by then to Prince Louis of Hesse, a kind, uncomplicated young German officer, and the wedding had been planned for the spring, in the full golden style, before the world ended. Postponing was discussed, of course, but her father had wanted the marriage, had arranged the marriage, and the family reached the very Victorian conclusion that the wedding would therefore proceed precisely because the dead man had approved of it, which meant the first royal wedding after Albert was conducted, in every sense that mattered, by his absence. It took place on the 1st of July, 1862, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and not in a chapel. It took place in the dining room. An altar was improvised at one end of the room, beneath the enormous family portrait that hung there, the one painted in the happy years, Albert seated at its centre, young and certain, his wife beside him, their children around them in the sunlight of 15 years before, which meant that Alice was married directly under her dead father's painted gaze, in the room where the family had eaten breakfast, in a house rented to grief. The guest list was tiny, family, and almost no one else. There were no glittering galleries, no trumpets, no roaring crowds, no illuminations, nothing of what her mother's wedding had invented and her sister's wedding had enjoyed. The men wore mourning. The Queen sat apart in deep black, her sons gathered close around her chair, screening her from the room, so that the mother of the bride was present at the wedding and yet hidden inside it, a black shape behind a wall of black shoulders, and witnesses say she barely watched the couple at all. She watched the portrait. Through the whole service, her eyes went up and to the painted man over the altar, as if the wedding below were a rumour and the picture were the fact. Alice herself was allowed white, for the ceremony only. A simple white dress, a veil of Honiton lace, a few orange blossoms, the entire national machinery of bridal joy compressed into the 1 hour for which it was still permitted. Before the ceremony she was in black. After the ceremony she went back into black. Her trousseau, the wardrobe a bride carried into her new life, had been ordered in the colours of the household, which is to say it was full of mourning, a bride's luggage packed for grief, and when she left with Louis for a few quiet days along the coast at Ryde, there was no cheering worth the name. The Queen wrote to Vicky in Berlin and described her second daughter's wedding in the phrase that has stuck to it ever since. It was, she said, more of a funeral than a wedding. And the terrible thing, the thing that makes the sentence more than a widow's bitterness, is that she was not wrong, and everyone present agreed. A wedding is a machine for public joy, and every part of that machine was standing in the room. The vows, the white dress, the lace, the young couple, and none of it could fire because the family operating it was broken. Hold the two sister weddings side by side for a moment, because the distance between them is the real measurement of what had happened to this family. 4 years earlier, almost to the season, the same lace on the bride, the same small determined mother presiding, and everything else reversed. Vicky had the chapel royal, the trumpets, the illuminated capital, the roaring crowds, a country in celebration. Alice had a dining room, a portrait, a congregation in black, and a mother who could not look at her. Same family, same God, same vows, same white dress, 4 years apart, and the difference between them was one man subtracted. If you ever want to explain to someone what Albert had been to this household, you do not need a biography. You need the 2 wedding pictures, held one in each hand. Alice, for the record, deserves a better ending than her wedding got, and history did not give her one, and I will say the one sentence of it and let it go, because she has carried enough of this night already. She became a serious, devoted, medically minded Grand Duchess, nursed her own family through diphtheria 16 years later, caught it herself, and died on the 14th of December, of all the days in the calendar, the exact anniversary of her father's death. The gentle ones, in this family, were not the lucky ones. But the century rolls on, and the machine of joy gets one more chance, almost immediately, at the grandest possible scale, because the next wedding in the queue is not a daughter's, it is the heir's. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, the eldest son, the future King Edward VII, needed a bride, needed one rather urgently by his parents' accounting, and the search had already been run through the stud books of Europe with the thoroughness of a military survey. The winner, scouted and vetted by his sister Vicky on the ground in Germany, was Alexandra of Denmark, 18 years old, dazzling, warm, unaffected, and by broad agreement of everyone who met her, one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe. The poet laureate himself, Tennyson, published verses of welcome hailing her as the Sea King's daughter come across the water, and for once the publicity undersold the product. When she landed in England in March of 1863, a country that had spent 15 months in the dark with its widowed queen looked at this radiant Danish teenager and simply lost its mind. Her entry into London on the 7th of March, 3 days before the wedding, was the largest thing anyone had ever seen the city do. The route ran for miles, from the railway station south of the river, over London Bridge, through the city and out west toward Paddington, and the entire length of it was one solid mass of human beings, roofs included, windows rented out at fantastic prices, garlands and banners and triumphal arches over the streets, and the crowd pressed so dense and so wild that the procession was repeatedly brought to a complete standstill with the princess's open carriage embedded in humanity like a boat in ice. Alexandra herself wrote home that the enthusiasm had been tremendous and the crush in the city genuinely alarming, and an 18-year-old who has just been loved almost to death by 1 million strangers is entitled to both halves of that sentence. London, starved of joy since December of '61, had decided this girl was the end of the famine, and it nearly flattened her expressing the sentiment. 3 days later came the wedding itself, and the wedding itself is where the two halves of this night, the white and the black, finally stand in the same room and stare at each other. It happened on the 10th of March, 1863, in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and that location was itself astonishing. No royal wedding had ever been held there. Royal weddings happened in London, at the Chapel Royal, in the capital, amid the crowds, on the pattern the Queen herself had built. But the Queen could no longer face London, or crowds, or, truthfully, weddings. And so the whole apparatus was moved out to Windsor, behind the castle walls, with the explanation that the dear departed prince would have wished it so, and there was no arguing with that, because there was never, ever any arguing with that. The public, who had rented every windowsill in London expecting a procession, grumbled at the sudden 20-mile commute, and one of the great society wits sniffed that the wedding of the heir to the throne was being held in an obscure Berkshire village, which is a tremendous thing to call Windsor Castle. Inside, the chapel was full of everything Alice's dining room had lacked: the peerage in force, the galleries packed, velvet, feathers, diamonds, trumpets, with one modification, and the modification was an order. The court was still in mourning, and so the ladies attending were instructed that their dress would be confined to grey, lilac and mauve, the official colours of half-mourning. Sit with that picture a moment, because there is nothing else like it in the whole history of British spectacle. The grandest wedding of the age, the future king marrying the most celebrated beauty in Europe, and the entire female half of the congregation is dressed, by command, in the colours of fading grief. Hundreds of women in silver grey and soft purple, glittering with diamonds from the neck up and dressed for a memorial from the neck down. A wedding conducted inside a mourning, with the dress code enforcing both at once. The bride wore white, satin and Honiton lace and orange blossom, the full inheritance, the one figure in the building dressed in the fashion her mother-in-law had invented, standing in a sea of half-mourning like the last lit window on a dark street. And the mother-in-law herself was not in the congregation at all. High above the choir of St. George's there is a small enclosed gallery called the Closet, associated for centuries with Catherine of Aragon, a place built for watching ceremonies without being part of them. And on the 10th of March, 1863, that is where the Queen of England attended her heir's wedding, alone, in widow's black, at a window above the whole golden scene, looking down on it like a figure from another play who has wandered into the wrong theatre. She did not process. She did not sit with the guests. She watched from the box built for a divorced queen 300 years before, and the congregation below knew she was up there, and mostly had the sense not to look. One distinguished guest who did look, a rising politician with more curiosity than caution, raised his eyeglass toward the closet for a proper inspection, and is said to have met, coming back down the lens, a stare of such glacial completeness that he lowered the glass and did not raise it again. He went on to charm her for decades and become her favourite prime minister. So the story ends well, but he never claimed the reconnaissance had been a good idea. And there was one more thing in the chapel that day that belonged to the dead man: the music. Among the pieces sung as the congregation assembled was a chorale composed by Prince Albert himself, so that the father who could not attend his son's wedding was present anyway, in the air, in the voices, for 4 or 5 minutes, and by every account this was the point in the proceedings at which the half-mourning dress code proved to be extremely well judged, because there was not a dry eye in the grey and lilac sections, and the widow at the high window wept openly, and then the service went on, because the service always goes on. Bertie was 21, in a general's uniform and the garter mantle. Alexandra was 18, and reported to be trembling, and also reported to be the only person in the building who looked entirely happy, both of which can be true at 18. They made their vows under the gaze of a hidden queen and a dead composer, and the trumpets went, and England had a Princess of Wales again, and the whole country outside the walls erupted into a night of bonfires and illuminations, and that, you would think, would be the scene everyone remembered. It is not. The scene everyone remembered, the scene the guests told for the rest of their lives, was 4 years old, wore a kilt, and was armed. Among the wedding guests was the bride of the last golden wedding, Vicky, now Crown Princess of Prussia, and she had brought her eldest son, Prince Wilhelm, aged 4, the Queen's first grandchild, dressed for the occasion in full Highland costume, complete, because Victorian formal wear did not believe in half measures, with a small ceremonial dagger, a dirk, at his belt. A 4-year-old, at a wedding, with a knife. The child was parked between 2 of his young uncles, Prince Arthur and Prince Leopold, themselves only 12 and 9, who had been given the assignment, and you can feel the staff work behind it, of keeping their nephew quiet for the length of a royal marriage service. What followed has entered every biography of the man the 4-year-old became. Wilhelm got bored, because he was 4 and the century's ceremonies were long. He began to fidget, then to perform. Instructed to be quiet, he escalated, in the manner of small boys and future emperors, and at some point in the proceedings he wrenched the ornamental stone, a cairngorm, from the hilt of his dirk and hurled it clattering across the chapel floor. Mid-service, a gemstone skittering through the wedding of the heir to the British throne. His uncles moved in to restrain him, whereupon the prince deployed his reserves and bit them in the leg. The accounts of the day disagree, charmingly, only on the arithmetic. Some say he bit the 12-year-old, some say the 9-year-old, some say his 18-year-old uncle Alfred took the wound, and the safest historical conclusion is that Wilhelm bit whichever relative came within range, and that the supply of bitten uncles met the demand. Earlier in the visit, for good measure, he had flung his young aunt's fur muff out of a moving carriage window. Nobody stopped him in any lasting sense. Nobody ever really would. The wedding guests dined out on the story for years, the way you would, and it stayed a funny story for exactly as long as the 4-year-old stayed for. He grew up to be Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man whose restlessness helped pull Europe into the First World War, and the little scene in St. George's Chapel sits at the front of his story like an overture. A small Prussian prince at an English family wedding, throwing his toys, biting his mother's people, while both nations smiled indulgently and the organ played on. And while the chapel had been kept half in mourning, the country outside the walls had been given no dress code, and the country made its feelings known. That night, cities across the kingdom lit themselves up, gas illuminations along the great streets, bonfires on the hills, fireworks over the rivers, crowds out until morning, the whole island glowing for a Danish teenager. Most of them had glimpsed for 2 seconds through a carriage window, if at all, and the potteries and the print shops had been ready for weeks, because a royal wedding by now was also a product line. Commemorative mugs and plates with the couple's faces transferred onto them, portrait prints for the parlour wall, medals, handkerchiefs, song sheets, the whole souvenir economy that this family's weddings had called into being, so that a ploughman's wife in Somerset could own a piece of a ceremony she would never see, for a penny or 2, and hundreds of thousands of them did exactly that. Every royal wedding mug on every shelf in the world today, every commemorative tea towel and biscuit tin, descends from this machinery. And the machinery was running at full steam in March of 1863, stamping the faces of Bertie and Alexandra onto everything that would hold still. The gifts, meanwhile, arrived at Windsor by the case. Jewels for the bride from committees and cities and courts, each consignment duly itemised and admired and reported in columns of print. Generosity as spectacle, exactly as at every wedding of the age, only here scaled up until the accounting itself became part of the entertainment. The bells of 1863 rang out over a country that felt, for one evening, young again. And around the wedding day at Windsor, the camera was waiting, because there was one more piece of business, and it produced the strangest wedding picture ever taken. By 1863, as we have seen, photography could finally attend a wedding, and so the days around Bertie and Alexandra's marriage were duly recorded. The bride luminous in her lace, the groom whiskered and pleased, the attendants arranged like porcelain, ordinary enough. But among those photographs there is one that stops people dead in archives to this day, and it was taken at the Queen's insistence, posed according to the Queen's instructions, and it is, depending on how you count, either a wedding portrait with 3.5 people in it, or the most honest picture the whole century produced. It shows the newlyweds standing in their wedding clothes. Between them, seated, small and round in her widow's black, is the Queen. And she is not looking at the couple, and she is not looking at the camera. She is looking up and away, at the fourth figure in the picture, which is a white marble bust of Prince Albert on a pedestal, positioned so that the dead man presides over the composition, gazing off in glorious profile while his son gets married beside him in mineral form. In some exposures from the same sitting, the couple look at the camera while the Queen contemplates the bust. In others, she seems to be presenting the couple to it, as if for approval. There is no photograph of her at this wedding in which the marble is not the point. And you can read the picture 2 ways, and the Victorians read it both ways. And so should you, slowly, because this is very much an image to fall asleep thinking about. Read coldly, it is a mother upstaging her son's wedding with a statue, grief deployed as scenery. The household gods rearrange so that even the future king marries in the shadow of the approved husband. Read warmly. It is the simple truth stated with a camera. This family had a missing member. The missing member had built half of what the wedding stood on, and pretending the gap was not in the room would have been the actual lie. Either way, it made one thing permanently clear to everyone, from the chapel to the colonies. The widow had attended the wedding, but the wedding had also been attended by the widowhood. And of the two, the widowhood held rank. She had watched the vows from a hidden box, she declined the breakfast and its toasts and dined quietly away from the celebration, and then she sat for the photographs beside the marble. That was the new settlement, and every royal bride for the next 4 decades would marry inside it. Welcome to the family. Here is the family. The family includes a bust. The machine nevertheless kept running, because the machine always kept running. Through the 60s and 70s, the remaining children went, one by one, into the market and out of it. Helena to a sensible German prince, Arthur in due course to a Prussian one's daughter. Each wedding correct, each wedding grey-edged. The widow presiding from closer range now, the patterns settling into routine. And then, in 1871, the routine broke. And it broke in a direction nobody in Europe saw coming. And the one who broke it was the interesting daughter, Louise, the 6th child, the 4th daughter, and the family's original, witty, moody, modern, and a genuinely gifted artist, a sculptor, which was not a hobby the century offered princesses. Louise talked her way into art school, which was simply not a thing princesses did, kept a studio, and would one day carve the great marble statue of her mother that still sits outside Kensington Palace, which is a sentence worth hearing twice. The statue of Queen Victoria that tourists photograph at Kensington was made by her own daughter. When the time came to find this particular princess a husband, the usual catalogue of minor German princes was opened, and Louise, in effect, closed it. The husband she got, with her mother's active and rather startling support, was John Campbell, Marquis of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll, a Scottish nobleman, a member of Parliament, a subject, not a prince, not royal at all, a citizen of her own country, outranked by every foreign princeling in the book, and the book was the problem, because no daughter of a British monarch had been given official permission to marry a British subject since 1515, 356 years. The last time it had been sanctioned, Henry VIII was on the throne and the bride was his sister. The courts of Europe were duly scandalized, on schedule, and the scandal ran into a fact it had not priced in, which is that British public opinion was delighted. The Prussian wars had made German matches smell of gunpowder and expense, and here at last was a princess marrying, as the newspapers happily put it, at home. Victoria herself defended the choice in exactly those terms. The old system of marrying every child into the same small pool of German cousins had had its day. And new blood, she argued. They would do the family nothing but good, and history, looking at what the old system's grandchildren did to each other in 1914, is not in a position to call her wrong. So on the 21st of March, 1871, at St. George's, Windsor, the experiment was performed. Louise came into the chapel escorted by her two eldest brothers and by the Queen herself, the widow walking her most headstrong daughter to the altar, and the bride wore, over the requisite white, a veil of Honiton lace that she had designed herself, the sculptor's hand visible right there on her own head, and married her Scottish subject in front of a court still faintly vibrating with the irregularity of it all. The marriage itself, I am obliged to report, turned out complicated, childless, and often chilly, because marrying interestingly guarantees an interesting marriage in every sense. But the door Louise walked through stayed open behind her. Princesses of Britain would marry subjects again and again in the century that followed, until it became the norm, and the foreign prince became the exception. And if you have watched a modern royal wedding, in which the bride or groom was simply a citizen with a job, you have watched traffic moving through Louise's door, which leaves one, the youngest, the one her mother never intended to see married at all. Beatrice was the 9th child, the baby, born when her eldest sister was already being fitted for a Prussian future. And after the catastrophe of 1861, her role in the household was assigned early and never revised. She was to be the companion, the one who stayed. She grew up at her mother's elbow, was called baby by the family well into adulthood, and by her 20s she functioned as the Queen's private secretary in all but name, reading the dispatches aloud, drafting the letters, managing the vast machinery of her mother's seclusion. The Queen, who had married for love at 20 and never recovered from where love led, had arrived at a simple position on the marriage question, as it applied to her last daughter, and the position was no. The subject was not to be raised. Courtiers knew not to raise it. Beatrice herself, by all accounts a shy, dutiful, deeply kind young woman, appeared to accept the assignment, and the household settled into the assumption that she would go grey at the Queen's side, the last lady in waiting, the daughter as furniture. Then, in 1884, the household went to Darmstadt for a family wedding, and Beatrice, 27 years old, met Prince Henry of Battenberg, called Lico, a tall, cheerful, career soldier prince with good eyes and no fortune, and the two of them did the one thing the entire architecture of her life had been designed to prevent. They fell in love, and Beatrice came home, and gathered herself, and told her mother she wished to marry him. What followed is one of the strangest domestic sieges in royal history, and I need you to picture the actual mechanics of it, because the mechanics are the story. The Queen did not argue. She did not forbid, shout, or negotiate. She simply stopped speaking to her daughter for 7 months. 7 months in which they continued to live together, work together, and eat breakfast at the same table every morning, and during which the Queen of the United Kingdom communicated with her own daughter, seated an arm's length away, exclusively by written notes, pushed across the breakfast table, past the toast rendered in diplomatic correspondence. The most powerful woman on earth and her closest companion, in total silence, exchanging memoranda over the marmalade, morning after morning, for over half a year, while the entire court tiptoed around the frost. As a display of what grief had done to the warm girl of 1840, there is nothing bleaker in the whole reign. And as a display of where Beatrice came from, consider that she did not fold. The shy one, the baby, the companion, sat opposite that silence every morning for 7 months and did not withdraw the request. In the end, it was the mother who moved, nudged along by the rest of the family, and the terms of surrender were pure Victoria. Beatrice could marry her Lico on 2 conditions. He would give up his commission in the Prussian army, and the couple would live with the Queen, not near her, with her, permanently. The marriage was licensed. In other words, on the understanding that it would change nothing. The companion would remain the companion and simply keep a husband on the premises, like a piano. Lico, to his eternal credit, looked at the deal, looked at Beatrice, and took it. And so, on the 23rd of July, 1885, the last of the 9 weddings took place, and it was, in its quiet way, the most extraordinary of all of them, and for once the extraordinary thing was gentle. It happened in a village church, St. Mildred's at Whippingham, the little parish church near Osborne, on the Isle of Wight in high summer, a country church in July, smelling of warm stone and cut grass, for the daughter of the sovereign. No abbey, no St. George's, no state trumpets, a congregation a fraction of the size of the great weddings, court and family folded in among the island neighbourhood. After 45 years, the family had finally arrived at the scale. Ordinary people had been marrying it all along, and the accounts of the day agree it was, of all the 9 weddings, the warm one, which tells you something. It took the century a long time to learn about the relationship between the size of a wedding and the size of the joy in it. And Beatrice wore the veil, her mother's veil, the Honiton lace of 1840, the year of the lacemakers of Beer, the work whose patterns had been destroyed so it could never be copied, brought out of its long retirement and set on the head of the 9th child. She was the only one. Not Vicky, not Alice, not Louise, none of the daughters before her had been permitted it. The lace was the relic of the marriage, and the widow did not lend relics. But Beatrice, the one who had paid for her wedding with 7 months of silence and a signed agreement never to leave, was married in it. And if you want to know what the concession meant, that is the measure. The Queen put the most precious object of her life on the daughter she could not keep from marrying, and by her own account, she came away from the day warmer than she had believed she still could. The couple honeymooned for a matter of days, a nod to a certain 3-day precedent, and then moved, as contracted, back in with mother. Lico got 10 years. He chafed, eventually, at life as the resident son-in-law, went off soldiering for a purpose of his own, and died of fever on campaign in 1896, leaving Beatrice widowed at 38, at which point she did the thing she had been raised from birth to do. She stayed. She was beside her mother to the very end. And after the end, she spent decades as the keeper of the family's papers, the editor of her mother's journals, the last custodian of the whole story you have been listening to tonight. So the youngest daughter married in the mother's lace, in a village church, in July, and the lace went back into its careful wrappings, and the century wound down, and you might reasonably think its work was done. It had one appearance left, the one I asked you to hold on to all those hours ago, and to see it we have to let the whole long reign come quietly to its close. Step back down from the palaces one last time, because while the 9 royal weddings were being celebrated and grieved and negotiated by memorandum, the thing they started had finished conquering everybody else. And an ordinary street in the 1890s is the place to see what 50 years had built. Picture a clerk's daughter marrying a schoolmaster in 1895 in a brick parish church in a railway town, and count the inheritance. The banns have been read on 3 Sundays, with her grandmother in the pew keeping score. The ceremony is at 11 in the morning, because it legally must be concluded by 3 and nobody respectable cuts it fine. She is in white if her family can possibly manage it, and if they cannot, her best dress has white somewhere on it doing its symbolic duty, and on her head is a veil, and in her hair or at her breast is orange blossom, wax, from a shop, chosen from a tray of identical sprigs by a girl who has known since childhood exactly what flower a bride wears, without once being told why. The breakfast afterwards is at her parents' house. The presents are laid out in the parlour with the cards displayed, and the neighbours file past the fish knives with expressions of admiration, several of which are sincere. On the table stands a cake in tiers, white and hard and architectural, iced in the smooth, blinding stuff everyone now calls royal icing, because everyone has seen engravings of the cakes it was named for. A photographer is booked. The couple will stand in the yard of his studio that afternoon, rigid and shining, and the picture will hang over the mantel for 60 years. And when it is over, they will take an actual honeymoon, a wedding tour, 3 days in Scarborough or a week in the Lakes if the schoolmaster has saved well, because the railways have taken the aristocratic wedding journey and sold it by the mile to anyone with a timetable, and a bride of this decade expects, as a matter of course, The thing her great-grandmother would have found frankly hilarious. A holiday, alone, with her own husband. Every single item on that list, the whiteness, the veil worn that way, the blossom, the breakfast, the displayed gifts, the tiered white cake, the photograph, the tour, either began or became universal inside one lifetime. The lifetime of one woman, and the woman was still alive, still in black, still at Windsor, while the clerk's daughter stood in the churchyard wearing the uniform she had accidentally issued to the world in 1840. Tradition is usually a river you cannot see the start of. This one you can. You can walk up it, wedding by wedding, and arrive at one rainy Monday, one dress on a form by a window, one small terrifying headdresser exhaling through her nose, and it is all still there at the source, perfectly documented, signed for, and wrapped in tissue. Which brings us, gently now, to the end of the reign, and to the question the whole night has been walking toward. Why a woman who wore black every day for 40 years went into the ground in white. Victoria grew old in her black. Into the 90s she went on, smaller and rounder and more permanent than the century itself. Empress now, grandmother to half the thrones of Europe, the weddings of her grandchildren arriving on the calendar like seasons. And in 1897, with her characteristic appetite for administration, she sat down and wrote out instructions for her own funeral, in detail, and the instructions contained a surprise that she told almost no one, and that makes sense of this entire night. She had worn black for 40 years for one man, but her funeral, she directed, was not to be black at all. She was a soldier's daughter and the head of the army, and she would have a military funeral, and the horror of black crape that had swallowed her whole life was, at the very last, to be banished. No black draperies, no black pall. White. The coffin under white, the streets hung with purple and white, and she asked that her people, so far as such a thing could be asked, not drown her in black either. The woman who had made grief her address for 4 decades ordered, for the end, the colours of a wedding. She died on the 22nd of January, 1901, at Osborne, in the house of the Myrtle bush and the dining room, with her family around the bed, and history, which has a taste for rhyme that no novelist would dare, arranged the room so that the grandson supporting her in his arms at the end was Wilhelm, the Kaiser. The 4-year-old with the dirk, the biter of uncles, grown into the Emperor of the Germans, holding his English grandmother as the 19th century ended in her person. Whatever else can be said about that man, and the following century said most of it, he loved her, and he was there. And then her own instructions were opened and carried out, and this is the part to hold your breath at. They dressed her in white. Her wedding veil, the Honiton lace of 1840, the lace of the village of Beer, the veil Beatrice had borrowed for one July day, was taken out for the last time and laid over her face and her white dress, and with her into the coffin went the little private museum of her marriage, tokens and rings and photographs, Albert's things, arranged by her instructions around her. The most famous widow in the history of the world was buried as a bride. 61 years after Miss Skerritt lifted that veil off its form on a rainy wedding morning, it went with its owner into the ground, and the 2 brides who had walked down an aisle under it were mother and daughter, and its last duty was also, in every way the woman herself could arrange, a wedding. The white, the veil, the going, at last, to Albert. They took her to Frogmore, in the grounds at Windsor, to the mausoleum she had built for him within days of his death and visited all those 40 years, and they laid her beside him, and above the 2 of them stand the marble effigies, and the marble holds one last secret, which is that hers had been carved decades early, when she was still young, and kept waiting, so that in stone, forever, they are the same age, 2 people in their early 40s, together, as if the whole second half of her life had been a long delay at a station, and the train had finally come. That is why the widow was buried in white, because underneath the empire and the black silk and the 40 years, the whole time there was a bride. And now there is almost nothing left to do tonight but walk back through the quiet and count what survives, like a caretaker locking up a museum, which is more or less what we are. The dress survives. The actual satin and lace of 1840, preserved in the royal collection, periodically displayed, visited by brides-to-be who stand in front of the case for a long time without saying much. The cake survives, in its terrible fossil slices, boxed and beribboned, surfacing at auction houses every few years to be photographed next to a ruler. The 12 turquoise eagles survive, scattered through collections, still occasionally landing on a velvet tray under a dealer's lamp. The sapphire brooch survives, the one Albert gave her the day before the wedding, the one jewel she wore to marry him. It stayed in the family, and it's been pinned, again and again down the generations, to the queens who came after her, so that a gift handed from a nervous 20-year-old groom to a nervous 20-year-old bride in February of 1840 still turns up, gleaming on television, at state occasions doing its quiet work a century and 3/4 on. The little closet still looks down into St. George's Chapel, where a divorced queen once watched other people's ceremonies, and a widowed one watched her sons. St. Mildred's at Whippingham still holds its services on summer Sundays. Warm stone and cut grass, and few of the visitors realise the quiet church they are sitting in once held a royal wedding whose bride had paid for it with 7 months of silence. The Chapel Royal at St. James's is still a working chapel, holding its services behind its unremarkable doors while the tourists stream past outside toward the more famous buildings. And the room where the whole white wedding began is, on an ordinary Sunday, one of the quietest places in London. And on the Isle of Wight, at Osborne, the myrtle is still growing. The same plant, tended for 180 years, still clipped, sprig by sprig, for the bouquets of royal brides who are photographed by machines no Victorian imagined, carrying a cutting from a bush planted from a posy given by a grandmother to a girl who once proposed to her own husband because nobody else was allowed to ask. Thank you for spending this long night among the weddings with me. It is easy to smile at these people, and we have smiled at them for 2 hours, at the cake you could not lift, and the gift lists in the newspapers and the small-armed Prussian, but I want to end kinder than that, because they have earned it. They lived inside a system that decided whom they could marry, in what colours, in which months, before which hour, and inside all those bars they went on doing the thing the system was never really designed for, which is loving each other. The queen who proposed in a rehearsed sentence with her heart going like a mail coach, the 17-year-old waving from the rail at Gravesend, the girl married under her dead father's portrait who became the family's nurse, the shy youngest daughter who out-silenced the most formidable silence in Europe. The machinery was cold and the people in it, over and over, were not. So tonight, be glad of the small ridiculous mercies of your own century. Be glad you can marry after noon, in October, on a Saturday, in any colour you own, to more or less anyone who will have you, without 3 weekends of public objections or a single line of your gift list in the morning paper. Be glad that nobody expects your wedding to reroute the foreign policy of Prussia, and be glad that if you love someone you are allowed to just say so, out loud, first, without checking whether you outrank them. Somewhere back down the long corridor of this night, in 1840, a girl of 20 is lying awake listening to the rain, working up the nerve to ring for breakfast on her wedding morning. She does not know any of what you now know. She does not know about the cake slices in the auction rooms, or the grey and lilac chapel, or the notes across the breakfast table, or the veil's last journey. She only knows that the rain is loud, and the dress is ready, and that today, against all the rules of her strange position, she is marrying someone she actually loves. It will go better than she fears and cost more than she imagines, which is true of nearly everything worth doing. Let her sleep a few minutes more. Let the whole enormous century sleep, the lace-makers and the bridesmaids and the bakers of unliftable cakes, the mothers at the docksides and the fathers in the portraits, all of them done now, resting. And so, my friend, are you? Almost. Let your jaw go, let your hands go.